Great, thank you. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this meeting of the Task Force on Cannabis-Derived Intoxicants and Illegal Cannabis Production, also known as the House Bill 3000 Task Force. We are glad to have you here today. And we will start with a roll call. And if you are here, Task Force members, get your finger ready on your mute button. And then when you are called upon, please identify if you are here and how you are participating. So Amanda, would you call the roll?
Yes. Representative Marsh.
Marsh is here by video.
Representative Morgan.
Morgan present by video.
Senator Przansky. Haven't seen him come in yet. Senator Hansel.
Present by video.
Rob Bovett.
Present by video.
Scott Winkles.
Present by video.
Sheriff Stickler.
Present by video.
Courtney Moran. Matt Cyrus. Not yet. Jay Noller. Amanda Metzler.
Present by video.
Brent Kenyon. Lauren Henderson.
Present by video.
Andre is going to be excused, I believe.
Yeah.
Okay.
Or something.
He's on jury duty.
All right, so I'm going to go ahead and mute everybody really quick. All right. Steve Marks.
Here.
Josh Eastman.
Here.
Emily Sitton.
Present by video.
And I believe we're having Bryn Hudson for Water Resources today.
Present by video.
Amanda Swanson.
Present by video.
And Tyler Bechtel.
Present by video.
I think I just saw Courtney Moran. Did you just join?
Yes, I did. Good morning, everyone.
Thank you. All right.
Right. Thank you, Amanda. Can you confirm that we have a quorum?
Yeah. We do.
Right. And we'll keep an eye out for latecomers who still join us, and we'll try to acknowledge that they're present as soon as they get here.
Okay.
So thank you. Thanks to members of the committee for being here. Just as a small summary of where we've been and what our purpose is. This task force was assigned in legislation in House Bill 3000 in 2021. We got some additional assignments out of 1564, which passed in 2022. We've been at work now for about 6 months, looking at a number of assignments that were delineated in both those pieces of legislation. Our assignment is to develop a report, including findings and recommendations for legislation that can be presented to the Interim Committee of the Legislative Assembly related to economic development no later than December 31st, 2022. To organize for this work, we assigned 3 subcommittees to look at specific areas of concern. And we also reserved a few topic areas for the committee, the task force as a whole. So we've been meeting as members in both the subcommittees, where we've also pulled in additional input when we needed it, as well as in the task force as a whole. So our goal today is to start to really look at what those recommendations are going to be that we are going to forward. We are going to go through the subcommittees and have them report out one by one, and also look at some of the bigger issues that we have assigned to the committee as a whole. Our intent today is not to vote on anything. This is our first blush looking at and hearing the recommendations from our subcommittees. So my goal will be to have the subcommittees report, tell us what they are working on or what they are ready to recommend. then we'll take a temperature of the group as a whole and see if there is generally affirmation or comfort with the recommendations from the subcommittee. If they are, then we'll assume that those recommendations will be incorporated into our report. If there's a fair amount of angst around anything that we're hearing from the subcommittees, then we'll decide what to do. Those options could consider sending content back to the subcommittees for additional consideration, or am I still live? Oh, okay. Everybody was sitting so quietly. I was afraid my internet had gone off because it has been erratic recently. So we could, if there's controversial issues, we can send them back to the subcommittee, or we can decide another pathway for evaluating them to get to consensus about inclusion in the report. My goal is that the report really is something that we come to by consensus of this group. This group has a lot of good thinkers around the table. If there happen to be issues that we divide upon, then we'll simply indicate that in the report discussion that those were items that were discussed that people had strong feelings about and that we don't have a solid recommendation around, but we'll note those issues in the report. So let me just pause there and just reach out to members. Does that sound like a good process for today? If anybody has any questions about what we're going to do today, please put them out. Okay, then we will forge on, not hearing any input or any concerns. So the first couple of issues that we want to address are issues that were really discussed by the group as a whole. And the first one is we had a conversation at a task force meeting a couple of cycles ago regarding administrative functions and the regulation of cannabis, specifically really focused on cannabis or hemp products when they have reached the point of being ready for human consumption. I think that's a major concern. So we assigned this discussion to Lauren Henderson and Steve Marks and Andre. And Andre is not here today, but I'm going to reach out to Lauren and Steve to tell us what your recommendations for administrative functions on this issue are. So I'm not sure who wants to kick us off, Lauren or Steve.
So I can. Good morning, everyone. Lauren Henderson. Prior meeting, I was the Deputy Director of the Department of Ag. I'm now the Acting Director of the Department of Ag. It's amazing how things change. Amanda, are you going to put the slides up for us so we can at least have them
Actually,
ready to?
I think
I am.
Sunny's going to, and I'm going to make her. I'm going to give her the.
Before I get started, and we'll get through this. I have to say, I want to give special kudos to Amanda and Sunny. Make a wonderful cross-agency team. They are a powerhouse. They took a very lively discussion between Andre, Steve, and I, and frankly, it was a little bit everywhere, out of the box thinking, and they actually were able to interpret. Sunny knows me very well, and Amanda knows Steve very well, and they were able to interpret what the heck we were saying and actually put it into something that made sense. So Sunny and Amanda, Sunny, you might put yourself on camera so that you can help us fill in the blanks, because I know both of you really understood this and were able to get it into a place that I hope the committee finds thoughtful and helpful. Steve's going to work through the actual slides themselves, but as you can see on the first slide here, we did talk about the question and really are proposing a registration type system for all retail hemp products, human and animal, that are outside of the existing marijuana requirements. We really tried to keep it our focus in our discussions, placing that consumer protection and health aspect at the foremost of what we were doing. We tried to make sure that we had, through what we're proposing today, that you'll see confidence in the marketplace, which is very important of what we have. And then lastly, trying to find something that we thought was actually practical for everyone, including the agencies to implement. And so that was the foundation for which we had the discussion. We didn't get too far down the road because we would like this committee to weigh in and say, did you hit the right tone here, or are you really off track? And then we'll have to make some adjustment there. But we didn't talk a lot about cost related to what this is. We wanted to make sure that we were on the right track. I will just say it has a cost to implement. Neither of our agencies have a ready registration system for them today. Steve obviously has metric and and the question about what that can do in that. So that will help formulate this as well. So I think we did agree at the onset that the committee was on the right track. One agency should do this, not bifurcated and all of that. But I'm going to let Steve and Amanda and Sunny please help us as we go through this if we miss something, and then we'll go through the slides and then go from there.
Thanks, Lauren. I'll just try to get us through the slides and then get us to the discussion. But as Lauren said, we did talk about, the registration coming forward, that we didn't talk about the funding of a registration that was good for a year. But that funding also needs to obviously be set and support the enforcement and oversight of the registration and what we're doing here. So that's something to consider that we need to do some additional work on as we move this from concept to more certainty. And then I would add, we talked about a fairly discrete level of registration by SKU and product type, really discreetly, but that's yet to be worked through. But we think it needs to be as detailed as possible to really discern the different products in the marketplace, not unlike any other consumer products that are out there. The application requirements, then would have the product name and type, the name of and address of the manufacturer, the mailing address of the manufacturer, the product certification, certificate of analysis, a copy of the submitted labels, the product registration fee, and then whether the product was adult use or not. Next slide, Sunny. Thank you. Labeling requirements, we'd have product name, the name and address of the manufacturer, the cannabinoids and ingredients listing, the link to the public website for the COA, then the net weight and volume of the product, any health and safety warnings would need to be included in that, adult use language if applicable, and then the serving size or number of servings or limitation on the packages. And then if food or any other applicable food labeling requirements would be required. Next slide, please, Sunny. And then enforcement, very parallel to what we're talking about for cannabis enforcement, that we do a market basket. We're going to help fund ODA's lab, I hope, in this next budget. So we'd be able to look and do a market basket to make sure that the products in the marketplace comply with the labeling and the across the spectrum of what they put in, especially for the standards for the ingredients. So we do a market basket survey. We'd buy products and analyze them in the ODA lab. So regardless of where this ends up, there's going to be a lot of crossover work that we have here. And then we'd be able to, we want to make sure that we have the ability to issue recalls, right, and stops of sales. So that was an important piece. And I believe we're at the last slide there. So we had substantial agreement about what we wanted. I think in part, talked about how detailed, and I know at different times we've talked about this track and trace. This really has the elements, I think, that we're looking for in the system, with a regular annual registration, with the COA that comes with the products. We know what to expect in those products in the marketplace based on that registration. So we'd be able to hold them accountable to that standard for all their products. What we know in their production is that they're going to have continuous batch testing, right? They're going to want to know, as they're producing these things throughout the year, what their own standards are. So they will be, having a trail for us to look at of those other pieces should we have issues to look at any manufacturer, any products in the marketplace that aren't meeting the requirements of the registration out there. I can say, I think, generally consistent with some of the other discussions here, sort of saying the discussion about moving cannabinoids for human consumption, towards the OLCC system. We think the registration, I know my commission is, and some of the discussions we have, think that matches together very well. I think this registration reflects the same kinds of things that we're looking for in our cannabis products on packaging and labeling and review. So I think that's very consistent on the growth side. That was outside of what we looked at and at separate. We did talk about, so I was charged with our group to continue to work with them. One of the first things we wanted to do is look at, could these requirements be met by the metric system and how, right? Because it obviously is different. A lot of the same categories of data we'd be collecting, less intervals, different intervals of collecting that information. So I want to work with metric to look at what it would take to do this, what the cost might be on that, and how we might be able to create a registration within that system. So that's one of the things that we want to be able to follow up on as we move forward with this.
So Lauren, would you like to add anything before we open it up for questions?
Just a couple things. One, we will probably need to vet this through some attorneys to make sure that we haven't come across any interstate commerce things. I don't think we have. So that's an outstanding question out there. I'll just say, for the most part, this structure matches. It's got some different nuances, but it's consistent with, we register fertilizer, feed products, and it's pretty consistent with that. Steve's got some things that's pretty consistent with that. It also should help in any recall because we have that registration information, which is really important when something goes wrong or something, that we can kind of follow that path through the registration system. If nothing else, to get an alert out to consumers, this product registered as this, and this, may have a problem and you need to return it. That's an important part of a system like this when you're talking about those kinds of things. We didn't really focus a lot on that. I think, as Steve talked about, we were in agreement on one agency. We didn't spend a lot of time and put a period at the end of it's got to be this agency because we didn't want to get too far ahead of the committee if the committee thinks this is good. But I will say we would need more resources to either modify an existing resource. I think Steve laid out pretty well the metric system and what it can and can't do. As I understand what this committee has talked about previously, and I know no one's voted on anything, but I understood that maybe they were you were wanting ODA to focus more on the handling or the growing and the handling, and then this would switch over to that other system, and we'd have to find out where those lines were, which I don't think we have. I will just say OLCC, ODA, and OHA are lockstep with whatever we're doing here. We're indifferent to that. I think we want to do what the right thing is for the state. So I'll just leave it at that, and it'd be good to hear the committee on, did we hit the mark or are we off?
Great, thank you. So I'll start us off with just a couple of questions. One is, do you need money to set up this regulatory system? I mean, at some point, we are expecting fees are going to have to cover the cost of the system, whatever those fees are. But the system has to be set up, presumably, before you start collecting fees. So have you calculated a startup budget?
No, we didn't get that far.
Okay.
We didn't get that far, but we could anticipate, right? We're going to at least need to find a limitation. Let's say, even if it's in Lauren's system or a metric, right? Well, I'm going to need limitation to be able to fund the work, whether I need money or whether it's general fund or it's some consistent with marijuana or cannabis funds that we could utilize for that. But there will be authorizations that need to at least be provided for us to move forward and be part of a project. The good thing is we already have a contract with them. That makes it a little easier.
Representative Marsh, you did bring up an interesting point that the legislature always has to deal with, which is how do you pay a startup on something you haven't registered yet when you're depending on the registration money? And sometimes you have to float those costs.
Yeah.
We had to do that when the hemp program, so we'd have to figure out, is the registration system phased in where you register products don't do a lot of enforcement, build up the money, and then you add that on the back end, but that's something we'd all have to figure out.
And that's exactly what, and that just add, that's exactly what we did when we started the marijuana program. We borrowed the money from the liquor fund and paid it back over time out of the proceeds of marijuana taxes.
And it sounds like, Steve, you might, if you were doing this, you might have the capacity to do it, but just need the limitation, just need the authorization, basically. So that leads me to my second question, and then we'll open it up, which is you all discussed but did not confirm your view of what agency should be taking on this registration. So I'm assuming, I want to first say, I think we all really appreciate the collaborative approach that's going on here between ODA and OLCC on this question. And I'm going to assume that you would like some input, and maybe even if we get to that point, direction from committee members as to how this might be structured. I'll go on record myself, and I'm sure we'll get input. I hope we'll get input from everybody, thinking that there is a natural shift, I think, that occurs when the hemp products are becoming fit for human consumption. And to my way of thinking, that docket of work, that is the production of human consumption items, is much more similar to the work that is ongoing right now within OLCC than it is to the work that's ongoing in Department of Ag. Department of Ag is well equipped to manage the hemp as it's being grown, it's being processed. But I think there is a point where the rapidly changing environment and the introduction of new elements really mandate that this be addressed by OLCC. So that's my opinion on it. I will be happy to hear the opinions of colleagues, as well as just any questions about this regulatory system, since this is the first time we've talked about it in this committee. And Rep. Morgan.
Hey, Chair Marsh, I think you actually said that pretty well, and we had a lot of discussions on our subcommittee on the cannabinoid side about who's doing labeling, who's doing the registrations and such right now. And I think that's kind of something to point out is we have one agency that's doing some of that and might need authorization to expand versus another agency that's not doing that scope yet and would have to build a whole program. And so it might be an easier conjunction to say that OLCC would be the appropriate one to do the registration, the labeling, such as they already have a program in place instead of having a second one come on board. And I guess if I had a question, that would be kind of that question of verifying that the product registration is a part of OLCC right now, but not necessarily ODA. Is that correct?
So, Chair Marsh.
Yeah, Steve, go ahead. Please jump in.
Representative Morgan. So we don't really just do a registration. I mean, ours is registration heavy. It's beyond registration, right? We keep track of everything along the way. So what we're really talking is a subset, a more annual filing, different intervals, but very consistent with what we do. The other piece that I would add is I think it's also instructive of some of the things that we may need to do on the cannabis side, get more delineated around SKUs, provide perhaps QR packaging like we might do for this market. But I think it's really using the registration to make sure you know what that commercial product is going into the open market. And quite frankly, we need to develop that side some on even though we track more detail on intoxicating cannabis products under our system, that we do need some of the refinement we're asking for product type out of a registration. So I think this really builds into something that the marketplace can use. And I use the example in the committee, in liquor, or I'll use liquor because I work with it, but take your product type. If you buy Jameson's, I get 750s, you got liter bottles, you got different sizes, you got the Jameson's with the glasses in it, you got the Jameson's that's sold. Each one of those are an individual product, skewed and understood in the marketplace for what they are and for pricing and for data and commercial sales and figuring out. So I think some of the things we're talking here about the registration actually really do help move it to a commercialized market that is readily understood in retail environments.
I do have a follow-up question unrelated, if that's okay, Chair Marsh.
Sure, of course.
Thank you. So one of the things that I saw about the registration, about it being annual or for the calendar year or annual versus the time that you register. I know through House Bill 3000, we moved our registration with ODA from being when they registered annually to kind of once a year and trying to get everybody on the same boat. So I thought you guys are now all have to be registered by January for grows. Is that not correct?
That's always been true.
Oh, okay. So it's not a new thing.
No.
Okay.
Hemp,
Because I
hemp
know that,
licenses are based on the calendar year. So even if you get your license in May, it is only good through December 31st.
okay. And that was what my recommendation was going to be. It's really annoying though, too, as in a different light. I just went through and got certified to be a commercial driver's ed instructor. Very exciting. And I'm already having to renew just a couple months after having to do it because it is for the calendar year. But it is one of those things that I think that's important to go that route. When I first came into the legislature and was trying to get a handle on how many hemp licensees do we have, and from year to year, there wasn't really it was like, well, they haven't renewed yet this year, so we don't have them yet, or they haven't renewed and so really trying to get a handle on the scope. And so if we do it by a calendar year of, I think it's just kind of one of those things that we can compare apples to apples easier on where we are with numbers. And so even though it seems a little regulatory, if somebody registered at the end of the year, they'd have to turn around and do it again in January. I would recommend that.
So Chair Marsh and Rep Morgan, if I could add to that, you're right. It is frustrating for folks like you that you get in and then 2 months later you have to do it. This topic has come up in the legislature before, and it always ends up at being, oh my gosh, you don't want to prorate licenses. That's a nightmare to administer. But the other reason is, I know you wouldn't do this, but on a product registration, then you get people who want to go in and out of the market. So they go, oh, I'm going to register just for 2 months and do this. And that never works very well because those that want to not play nice are manipulating the system. So it makes it better. And then, of course, the other part of this and the little secret is you can't run a program on people doing, those kinds of things in the prorate because you have to have the staff that are there 24/7. But I haven't figured out a way in my lifetime to make that easier for people. So the calendar system has worked well for us. The annual system, we have some due in July and some due in the winter. So.
Rep Morgan, did that get your questions?
Well, I remember just watching the presentation. That was one that looked like was a question. So as a member weighing in, my preference would be calendar year versus registration year on that one.
Yeah.
Director Marks raised his hand at me. Was that a question?
Yeah, I do. I just want to raise my hand because want to think about this a bit. This is a little bit. We have the manufacturer registration, right? And then we get the products. And I just want to, I think we need to think about how we work that together because, when companies develop products, they want to get them on, they come late, they come when they're developed. I'd understand they need to pay, but we might think about that as, we're talking about this as a product registration, but some of our semantics are as it's the manufacturer of the products registering and keeping those products current inside that. So I think we should think about that some, about how we deal with the manufacturer of the products that's registering and the products themselves as a distinct item.
Well, and I'd like to clarify.
So Steve,
sorry.
Mm-hmm.
So Steve or Lauren, can you clarify that this registration system, right now we're at a fairly high level. Is a registration system the right way to approach this with the outline that you provided? And secondarily, what agency should administer it? Would this be adopted in a rulemaking process? No.
Yeah.
Depends on what the legislation says.
Yeah, it depends on what the legislation says. I do think the detail of this kind of thing, like how we would make that work economically for fees to be systematic and accountable in that, I think that could be done through rulemaking for certain. So it's just matters of how much clarity you want to give any agency and the top line advice, and then give us the ability to put that together so it works for both the legislative expectation and as best we can make it mesh for the marketplace.
Yeah,
Okay.
the legislation's gonna have to say that a fee can be established for this somewhere. I don't know if there's anything, I don't have anything existing that would allow me to add this fee. And then the rulemaking can establish the fee if it's, if it says it's on a cost recovery basis, then the legislature doesn't have to pinpoint the exact fee. And then the legislation might have to add a fund that it goes into, Steve, unless you think I don't have a fund, I could put this in, well, maybe I could mix it into the hemp fund. I don't know if you have one or not, or if you need specific place for the cash to go so everybody knew what it was for.
So let's assume that there's probably an unending number of details that will need to get flagged and worked out if this is the right approach. And whether that happens through legislative direction or rules yet to be determined. But I welcome those flags on details that would have to be discussed. And I'm really interested in general comments about the approach and the administering agency.
And I think in my report later, you'll have more from my subcommittee as well on part of it, maybe.
Wonderful. Okay, Amanda Metzler.
Thank you, Chair Marsh. I wanted to thank the OLCC and the ODA for their work on this proposal. This is the accountability that we needed, and I think the registration process would be the right way to go. And Chair Marsh, I also agree with you on ODA kind of taking over or still continuing with the growing portion of hemp and the other portion of that being regulated by OLCC.
Thank you. Thank you, Amanda. Any other comments or input or questions? Emily from BOLI.
Hi, I just had a kind of a clarification question. I think on the first slide it had mentioned like products for animal use, and then I didn't see anything further on the other slides about that. I don't know if that was something you were considering also including in the registry and regulation.
Yeah, we want to make sure we didn't miss pet treats or pet, particularly the hemp market seems to have a lot of consumables for hemp, right? For animals, for pets in hemp products. So we want to make CBDs and otherwise we want to make sure we were inclusive of those products.
Okay, thank you. I just wasn't sure if that would be something addressed in further details, I guess.
And this is Chair Marsh and Amanda. That's a great question. The other thing that I think I think we're forced to include animal products because we have seen in our experience that if you don't, you get things labeled for animals, but they're really for humans, and they get around that system. It just creates I can give you lots of examples of that, but I won't because they bring back bad memories. But you have to include it.
Thank you, Lauren. Courtney Moran.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much, Chair Marsh. Thank you, Steve and Lauren, for putting this together. I just had a few clarifying questions. So, in the subcommittee, we talked about the product registration, which we agree is the best path forward. But I just wanted to clarify the scope. And so would this apply to any products sold in state and online coming into state?
Lauren or Steve?
Yes.
Okay, so end product, and then what about ingredients coming into the state?
Ingredient.
Well, presuming, I'll take my shot at presuming we have packaging and labeling requirements, right? And ingredients on there that my view was anything on the packaging requirements that we have for organ products to be sold. If we have ingredients as part of that requirement, then that would apply to out of state as well. But mindful of Lauren's warning on lawyers looking it over and the interstate commerce issues.
That's a great
Courtney,
question.
other questions?
Yeah, we may have to think about that a little bit more. Courtney brought up a good thing. So if it's a,
Oh.
if there's 8 parts to the product and they're bringing in just one part of it, this probably what we just set up might not include that. Sunny, what do you think?
Right. This is for the final retail products. And so they would still, it would not, the way I think we were discussing it, include those ingredients going into it. But those COAs that they have for that final retail product would capture, hopefully, any concerns that we might have about those ingredients.
And
Okay.
and let me just add, Courtney, just so if it's like listing on the packaging issue, we did have the discussion, and you'll recall, and Morgan and Representative Morgan's subcommittee about, whether we would have a website with, using, whether it would utilize, we said, a QR code if you were going to have substantial ingredient, information that needed to be made available to the consumer. And we did have, a long discussion about what needed to be available to the consumer.
Okay, yeah, because I'm just thinking when we had the representative from California come, they had talked about they have the ingredients that they register or license versus the end products, and this would be kind of the opposite. We have end products, not the ingredients. I wanted to clarify that. And then, we've talked about this in the subcommittee. I think we all agree it does make sense for product registration, labeling, packaging review to go under OLCC. We're already doing this for the hemp products going into the dispensaries. It doesn't make sense for ODA necessarily to take that on and have to create the other program. And we agree with Director Henderson and Rep Marsh, what you said earlier, that hemp growing and manufacturing licensing, that does need to stay under ODA. But then I was confused about the comments about the product registration going into metric. So I don't understand the correlation between those two. And I'm wondering, is that an attempt to cover Section 18 of House Bill 3000? Because I didn't think that our subcommittee had gotten to any conclusion about that and thought we were really trying to lead more toward GMP type model for product tracking, not metric.
So Courtney, I'll
Or-
just
let
me just respond directly. Just think of metric as whatever OLCC system is. If we say this is what we want to register, I'm looking to see if that system will register, will produce it and capture the information in the way we say we want it captured. So it's not unique, it's not changing. I'm asking metric because a lot of this is captured in different ways within the metric system now. We're just talking about a different interval of time, different toggles of information at a higher level, one time a year. So we're looking to use the software system to accommodate what we say are the requirements we want for the registration. So, if you said literally, let's set up those requirements and we'll put it out for bid. What I'm really asking is, can metric meet the requirements of the registry and do it through that system because I have an existing contract with them.
Okay, yeah, as you learn more, I think we'd appreciate understanding that. I know there's going to be widespread concern from the hemp industry having to go under metric. So I think if we could just clarify how, like what you're thinking and how that would work and what that would really mean, that would be very helpful for us. And Lauren, if you could clarify the Section 18 piece, that would be helpful.
Section 18 piece, help me.
Section 18 was the clause in House Bill 3000 about creating some sort of tracking mechanism for hemp. Or Amanda, maybe you have the answer.
Yeah, I put my hand up just because that was part of House Bill 3000, but that actually wasn't part of any of the considerations for the task force to be looking at, which I think is why we haven't really been discussing Section 18 in that detail.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree with you. I spoke to Rep Marsh about that too. Like, I don't think that was in the scope of the task force. Just when I'm hearing metric and I'm hearing product registration, I'm just wondering how does that interplay with the authority granted in Section 18? And just think we should all be cognizant of that as we're developing whatever statutory language is going forward for a recommendation to deal with the product registration piece.
Yeah, this is Chair Marsh, Courtney, that's a good flag. We'll go back and kind of look at that again. I don't think it's a dead end. We were really trying to find, really, in simple terms, rather than us charging all the registration and building in, my words, you guys, a fancy state IT system and have it take a long time to develop and kind of get up to play. And, I could probably tweak maybe one of ours, but not really, and to see if metric could be, my words, tweaked, for lack of a better word. Can it do the registration system? It's something that Steve already has a relationship, and not have this big expensive IT fiscal that goes along with anything that we want to do. Is that simple enough, Steve? I mean, that's really what we were talking about.
Yeah, I mean, it's a mega process to put in place and go through the IT review that we'd have to do to do it. It takes me 2 years to get IT projects approved and move forward, and then you got to go back and get the authorization for the funding in the next cycle. So if they can meet the requirements of what we define as a group of what we want, then, if we can utilize them to produce the information and the data and capture it in the way that we've agreed a registration should and could work, then, there are opportunity to utilize them at, with a little more efficiency and cost overall, because development or waiting to go through the process is costly.
And then we're going to have to figure out, I'm sorry, Chair Marsh, we're going to have to figure out, once metric gets back, what is the actual cost to do exactly what the activity that we just lined out, which, Courtney, I think certainly part of your concern, is it going to be, that big number that's already in there or not? But we don't know that until we figure. I think the other thing, you guys, is we're going to need some help. I don't think OLCC ODA have a good handle on how many products are out there. Maybe we do, and I don't know it, but it's going to be a wag.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for that clarification. And I want to say thanks to Amanda Metzler for your comments earlier too. So thanks, Marsh.
Mm-hmm. And Brent Kenyon. And then I think we're going to, unless I see some more hands quickly, we'll move on to our next subject area.
Yeah, I just wanted to be clear on this. So now we're not looking at, I would suggest that we, as far as product registry from out of states, definitely would to include specifically the cannabinoid products that are coming in. As Courtney said, California was doing that. I don't think we want to skip that. I think that's the most important piece. I don't care where they're getting their gelatin for the gummies, but it's the cannabinoid product we're worried about. So I would suggest that we do include that in the registry.
Any comments from the team?
I'll just say yes. And Brent, if we had interstate commerce, we'd do something like that for intoxicating cannabinoids coming in as well. So this will help us in one way be ready, provide some readiness for interstate commerce should it come in intoxicating cannabinoids as well.
And Rep. Morgan will give you last word on this subject area.
Thanks, Chair Marsh. We heard presentations in the subcommittee on the good manufacturing process. We did not ever come to consensus as a subcommittee on doing that. At the time, the presentations we were seeing, we were hearing that it could be costly up to $50,000 or more for an individual business to register and essentially get that certification so they can show their product is a GMP product. But that is not necessarily, we never really got to consensus at coming back to it. And so the consensus things that we did talk about was the product registration, those things that are for human consumption, the things that would have an intoxication, that they would have consumption, or that they would be registered and certified, whether it was from out of state or in state, for the sake of the safety of our consumers. And making sure that we have the right labeling and different stuff. And I'll talk more about that later, but even though we did get a presentation on it, but it seemed to be something a company could do above and beyond to kind of give themselves a, hey, look, I'm the gold standard versus being the state to require it. And we never really circled back to have consensus as a committee. So I just want to be careful that we clarify that.
Thank you, Rep. Morgan. Okay, team. I think the comments that we've received today are certainly validate the approach that you presented to us today, the registration approach. We've seen a number of specific questions about how this might work. I think we've also heard pretty good affirmation of that the committee members who spoke today believe that this function should be under the OLCC, that we should keep ODA with the growth cycle, managing hemp as a crop, but at the point where there's actually a product for human or pet consumption, animal consumption, that regulation in the form of a registration system should shift to OLCC. So I'm going to ask Lauren and Steve if you can go away and further refine the proposal, and then we will move it forward to inclusion in the report.
Absolutely.
Okay, thank you. Okay, the next item on for our discussion today is around funding. You will remember that we had a discussion about this in the committee as a whole. We agreed there needs to be funding for this work as it continues. You'll recall we have some money in the existing cannabis fund that's administered by the CJC. We had another 20 million plus, I think 5 million dedicated to water resources that was allocated in the special session of 2021. We had an additional $6 million for humanitarian community-based organizations that was allocated in the special session of 2022. And after discussion, we assigned this to yet another subcommittee led by Rob Bovet to come back to us with recommendations for optimal funding and maybe for a recommended funding source, although we didn't make that a requirement. So Rob, can you tell us what the discussion has led to?
You bet. Thank you, Madam Chair. We met and talked through the current funding, which you actually excellently summarized. One is more historic. That's the IMM EGP. It's a grant program at the Criminal Justice Commission. It's been in existence really since the beginning of recreational marijuana in Oregon, and it was enhanced by the funding sources that you mentioned earlier, Chair. We also have the two new additional buckets of funding that we received more recently related to crime victim services, the $6 million for the CBOs that you mentioned. Here at CJC, we granted out those dollars, but it's a fairly new program. We got a report, as you know, on what's happening so far, as well as the $5 million additional for WRD for Water Master resources. So we talked about all of that. Plus, we also talked about the unmet need. So even though the legislature allocated one-time money of $20 million for the enforcement side, which covers both law enforcement and code enforcement, here at CJC, we received quite a lot more applications than we were able to fill. And quite frankly, many of our applicants actually trimmed their budgets in order to try to make it all fit statewide within the $20 million we were allocated. So we looked at all of these numbers, which flow from different programs and stem from different times. And here's our basic recommendation, but I have to give you a caveat. The caveat is this is a moment in time snapshot for what we think we would need today. That may look different in 5 months or 6 months. I'm not really sure. So we'll need to probably take another look in 5 or 6 months. But the recommendation at this moment would be for all the IMM EGP enforcement grants to have at least $40 million as a floor. That would include the 20 million plus the back stuff that we had before, plus the unmet need. In terms of the victims portion, the $6 million, we just recommended that the funding be continued at that level for now until we can size up the needs. We hear back essentially from the two CBOs that are running those programs to find out whether or not we adequately funded those. And then finally, the same answer on the WRD side, continue the same level of funding, the enhanced $5 million, until we hear more from WRD as to whether or not that has met the need, it's too much, too little. So that's the basic recommendation we have for you. I should also note that this does tie, at least in part, with the recommendation that you hear later from the law enforcement subcommittee, because we did change our approach to cleanup. and focus more heavily on code enforcement and nuisance abatement, which will need more enforcement dollars. So we are calling that a $40 million floor in terms of the recommendation. In terms of source of funding, that gets really dicey and political, of course. We didn't make an affirmative recommendation. My own position is we probably had to use marijuana taxes first to make sure our cannabis programs work. But I know that just that statement alone is political. Really, it's kind of left up to the legislature as to where those dollars come from. From my perspective, funding it out of the top of cannabis taxes like the core or basic IMM EGP grant program is funded now provides two things. One, it ensures that we're using cannabis monies to make sure our cannabis programs work well, but also stability of funding. Because if we continue to get 2-year increments of funding, of general fund dollars, the core problem with that is in terms of hiring law enforcement staff, that makes it very challenging to provide stability to funding. So we encourage stabilized funding. I have my own idea how to stabilize that, but that may not meet with other people's needs or political preferences. So that's the basic gist of our recommendation to the committee. Again, we're going to need to reassess this probably early next year to see if those recommendations still hold. And with
Thank you, Rob.
Take questions or comments, whatever.
Yeah, I do have a question. So the existing money, what's your recommendations about phase-in? Because my understanding was the existing money, at least theoretically, was supposed to take people through 2025. I don't know if that's realistic. Is that realistic? Then that would mean we're allocating essentially in next biennium for funding that would be available in the biennium to follow.
Right, and we'll have to phase that and try to figure out when the money runs out. And that is especially true, I think, for the two, I would call them new programs or enhanced programs related to victims assistance and water resources department, because they're so new that we may need to reassess when we start and stop money. So it's a very valid point. I'm just not sure how to answer it at the moment.
Got it. Questions? Tyler.
Yeah, thank you, Chair Marsh. And more of comments than questions. I wasn't involved in the discussions about funding at all up until this point. So pardon me for coming in late to the game. I just wanted for the committee to consider that the state police is not eligible for criminal justice commission grants. And I would like the committee to consider our funding. Essentially, Measure 110 capped the amount that we get, and the problem's grown. And something that the state police gives that individual grant teams don't give is a multi-jurisdictional expertise. So when you're looking at these cases that span multiple jurisdictions, we have someone that can work in all of those jurisdictions without pulling them out of their primary jurisdiction. We have expertise that we've developed over time, specifically when it comes to marijuana extraction or cannabis extraction labs. Frankly, if you have a BHO lab that's active, I will be the person in there decommissioning it. And my appearance here or at any of those cases really essentially comes at the expense of a trooper on the road. So we've got now 8 people dedicated to marijuana as far as detectives and a couple of sergeants. But those again are at the expense of troopers investigating major crimes or at the expense of troopers on the road. So I'd just like to throw that out there. Totally speaking above my pay grade and without the authorization of my command prior to that, but I'm sure they would also agree with me that we are in need of more resources to pick up where the grant teams just aren't suited to address this.
Thank you, Sergeant. I appreciate that. I'm sure we all do. I do want to note that Measure 110 capped the amount of funding to go to state police from cannabis taxes, but did not cap the amount of the budget to go to state police from all sources. It simply shifted responsibility to the general fund.
Yeah.
Sheriff Sickler. Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to cut you off. Did you want to respond to that?
Yeah, I did really quick. And, you know, as I remember it, when we first got the marijuana funds, it kind of came in one end and out the other. So while I did cap, you know, even prior to that, we filled in with marijuana money, but we lost money other places. We've recovered in subsequent legislative cycles, and so we're well thought of, well funded, and we thank the legislature for that. But when it comes to this specific area, I really feel like we could use some help.
Sergeant
Understood.
Bechtel is being gracious and kind. When 15% of the Measure 91 funds were supposed to go to state police and they did, then everybody said, oh yeah, see, we're funding marijuana enforcement, we're funding the state police. But they literally took just as much out the back end, so they had to do it without any additional funding. And so he is literally being gracious to say we could use some help here. And I really appreciate him bringing it up. It is important that we take care of local and the state police in this partnership.
Thank you. Sheriff Sickler.
Yeah, good morning, everybody. I concur with Sergeant Bechtel. I do feel like if there's a way to include them in the process, it is a benefit to our team to have the state police available to help and be partners. So enhancing their staff and is an opportunity to enhance all of our staff to some degree, depending on the size and scope of the location. Also, just some things about the funding is currently we're very grateful for the grants. I mean, it's really saved us. So I really appreciate the effort this far. The only challenge that, you know, we have with this, the funding is, you know, expiring in 2025, December, is trying to figure out how to make that funding work over time. So our grant request had to calculate the funding available divided over the time, so the staffing request could fit within that number, if that makes sense. So we did pare back our request a little bit, and you know, we do get the lion's share. So I am thankful for that, and I do think we're adequately funded based on what we're seeing right now. Of course, that could change, but the importance of having sustained funding does allow us to continue our efforts ongoing, which I think will be needed into the future if we're going to, you know, kind of eradicate the black market from Oregon. And so, you know, in its current form, I will have to evaluate, you know, if there isn't a funding stream that comes beyond 2025, how do you bring back those FTEs that are grant funded into our regular general fund allocations? And so it doesn't even mean that there may be enforcement until December of 2025, because if I have an opening, I have to have that balance of where does that FTE go for how long and whatnot. So just the importance of the ongoing, or at least the ability to secure funding beyond 2025 is crucial to our mission to, you know, get rid of the black market and support the industry so they can thrive.
Thank you, Sheriff. Brent Kenyon. Brent, I see your hand up. Are you here?
I just wanted to concur on the state police funding as far as this conversation goes. I'm going to bounce back a little bit to what Rob said. We did discuss a bit about the environmental issues, and I think talking to county commissioners here in town on the need to be aggressive as far as the cleanup effort goes. We've seen a lot of stuff sitting. We've got an environmental disaster down here that's not quickly being dealt with. And we were talking about solutions for that. Obviously, funding is the key to that, but having some kind of reimbursement budget or something so we could be proactive immediately and get right into that, because there's a lot of this stuff's been sitting a couple years. We've got plastic deteriorating, going into the ground, which will never be certified organic land again. And the enforcement process, I mean, we've heard about some of the bad players paying fines for people at the county so they can continue to try to do the activity. I mean, there's all kinds of things that are preventing the property owner from actually taking action and cleaning up the mess. I haven't seen a ton of that happening yet, and time is going by where the environment can't wait to be dealt with, as far as sending them notices every month to make sure they're doing the cleanup. And even with the enforcement, going short of going out there and forcing them to do it, it's almost in my mind where we have to come up with a plan to go in and handle it, and then deal with collecting that money from the property owner and the back end, but deal with the environmental issues immediately, because it's getting out of control. And this is, you know, a good portion of the state, I'm sure, the same issues. And maybe Nate can speak to that a little bit more, but we definitely need to deal with that. It's getting out, and I know it's a topic and it's been brought up and we're talking about what to do about it, but it's really a time sensitive issue that's got to be dealt with sooner than later. So, and the commissioners here were open to some ideas around potentially using county and getting reimbursement if the money isn't there immediately, and then working on collection efforts, which would be the enforcement piece to get that money out of the property owner to pay for their mess. So I'm just really concerned that we need to take that seriously and work on it hard at this point.
So we have a recommendation on the table for a $40 million floor, an additional $6 million for the community-based organizations, and $5 million for the Water Resources Department, or at least those are the current funding levels for those two grants. And Rob, I'm going to ask you if you think your subcommittee would want to have another meeting to discuss the question of state police and how they fold into any of these recommendations.
You bet. We didn't actually discuss state police funding, as Tyler mentioned, but I want to associate myself with every utterance from Tyler.
Okay.
And as further described by Representative Morgan, I think that's 100% accurate. So we ought to talk about it, but maybe we can have one more meeting. I may be suggesting in December-ish or a little bit later down the road, if that's possible, because I think we're waiting for more information on a few of the other things too.
I don't see any disagreement from this group around these recommendations as a whole, more just the issue of state police. So what we need is you to have that meeting in time for us to get specific numbers into the report, which I'm assuming we could do any time, you know, before we have to report in mid-December to the legislative committee.
Sounds great.
Amanda is the report, the primary report writer. Would you agree with that timing question?
I think we could do a lot of the narrative, and then we could plug in the numbers. I think that would be fine.
Right. And Steve Marks, I think you had your hand up. I'm sorry, I didn't get to you.
I'm sorry, if you were getting to the recommendation, and I know you got a lot to cover in the agenda, but you know, I can't tell you how important state police has been to us, and this whole effort that we're putting forward really can't, you know, the legal system doesn't exist without the context of enforcing against what is not in the legal system, you know, and that threatens the revenue side. So every effort that we got investing in this coverage, I just came back from Ontario, and, you know, marijuana enforcement is not the highest order of priority, as you know, for law enforcement agencies. They got so many other particular problems, and using our revenue to help make this system, or using our resources to help the synergies of moving forward and keeping the legal system legal is just so vitally important. You look at California and where they're going, they haven't got a handle on it. They've got side by side equality between the illegal market and the legal market, and it's going downhill and very hard to control. We took the right steps here in Oregon. I just want to reinforce that discussion that we're having, because it's vital to the survival, I think, of a really strong commercial system here in Oregon, one that protects consumers, protects public health and safety. You know, we don't have to worry about laced cannabis products with fentanyl in them as much as other areas, or other, you know, breaking bad chemistry. This is the part of it that helps keep that consumer side clear. So
okay,
can't be more supportive.
You persuaded us. So we're gonna, I'm going to forward this recommendation on behalf of the committee to the report. We're going to encourage Rob to bring his committee back in the beginning of December, and I'm sure you will extend the invitation to that meeting to Sergeant Bechtel at that time, so he can also participate in that conversation. At this moment, I think our recommendation for funding comes without a recommendation as to source. I know that there's a lot of strong feeling on behalf of some members of this group that should come from the cannabis revenues. My own sense is that throws us into politics that we don't need to engage in here as a task force as a whole. And I didn't hear a strong recommendation that from the funding subcommittee. So Rob, I'm going to say, if your committee has a change of heart and really strongly believes there should be a recommendation for cannabis tax revenues, let us know that. Otherwise, I'm going to assume that you're going to continue to refine the specific numbers and the inclusion of the state police.
Sounds great, Madam Chair. We'll do both of those things in early December.
Super. Thank you so much. Colleagues, now we're moving on to our subcommittees and listening to the recommendations from those subcommittees. We're doing really well moving through this material. Thank you for your participation. So the first subcommittee was the Water and Natural Resources Subcommittee, which I convened with the help of our very able Sunny Summers from ODA. And I'll just report briefly on our recommendations. Basically, the recommendations that came out of our subcommittee, we have handed on to different subcommittees, so there won't be any recommendations specific from our subcommittee. But let me tell you some of the things that we discussed. On the subject of water use, we discussed the question of beneficial use, the standard of beneficial use, because that has been controversial in some of these conversations. And we confirmed, by the way, with Legislative Council that the interpretation of beneficial use that's being used by OWRD is consistent with statute. But as we thought further, we realized that the individuals who continue to talk about beneficial use are really interested in the question of how to prohibit the use of water for illegal operations. So we don't have to change the beneficial use standard in order to do that. And as a result of that conversation, we recommended to the Law Enforcement Committee that we expand the prohibitions on the use of hauled water for cannabis operations as defined in statute in House Bill 4061 and include the use of water from any sources. So when a operation is busted and it's illegal, we can add to the prosecution of those individuals the penalties for the use of water, whether it comes from irrigation systems, from wells, from hauling, or from whatever source. So that is our recommendation on water. And we're hopeful that our law enforcement subcommittee has talked about that. On the question of natural resources, we brought in the individuals from the Department of Justice to talk about their environmental crimes unit. We talked to local DAs. We talked to our code compliance folks, and we made another recommendation to the Law Enforcement Committee that we make changes in prosecution that would, number one, establish a plant threshold. So for operations with more than a given number of plants, say 1,000 or maybe 100 or whatever that number is, that there be higher penalties. So that we're actually making a distinction between smaller grows and bigger grows. And we also recommended that there be consideration of the addition of ecological damage or the evidence of ecological damage as part of the prosecutorial lineup of issues. And finally, on the natural resources front, we met with representatives. We know that OWRD has been deeply involved in all this cannabis work, and we funded them so that they can now go out with operations with law enforcement and really assess what's going on with illegal water use. But our other natural resources, DEQ, Fish and Wildlife, know that they are often have issues that are implicated in these operations, but there's not been a very good method for actually involving those agencies in knowing what's going on or engaging them in operations that need to happen after a site has been busted. So in our conversations, OWRD agreed to convene their sibling natural resource agencies, bring them together, and to talk about how we could establish a network of communication and coordination among the natural resource agencies so that they can be better prepared to come in and take action when it's warranted. We thought that was a great breakthrough. We're really happy to OWRD for agreeing to convene that conversation. And we asked them to tell us if they needed any kind of legislative support for that. To this point, we've not heard from them that they need anything from us. So we don't have a specific recommendation. We just have a big pat on the back and affirmation for their willingness to bring that conversation together. So anybody from the subcommittee want to add to what that quick summary of our conversations? Okay. If not, then again, those are the the report, I'm sure, will reference the conversations that we've been having, but the recommendations specifically that we generated, we thought were better discussed in the context of law enforcement. So we handed them on. All right, then, unless there's questions or comments from committee members or complaints about the way I summarize things, then we will move on to the next subcommittee, and that is the cannabinoids.
Wait, we have something with Mr. Johnstone.
Oh, Jake, you're here. I didn't think you were going to be here today.
Sorry, I apologize for my truancy. I had another thing I couldn't get out of. Just piggybacking off what Rep. Marsh said, I think one of the reasons that the water group didn't feel that there was a legislative need for what we were talking about there in the Southwest region was that most of the legislation, or rather the statutes and rules, exist for us to do a lot of what we need to do. It's just mainly coordination. So Southwest Region Manager Justin Dillon raised his hand to try and get some better coordination going amongst our natural resource partners, county code, and law enforcement in the area. So I just wanted to highlight that. And in some of our ongoing discussions in this group and others, we've been looking at technologies like, just text message blasts and more convenient, quicker ways for us to coordinate with law enforcement when there are one of these operations that are ongoing, so that ourselves and other natural resource partners and enforcement groups could try and address the issues as timely as possible. So just wanted to add that in there. Thanks, Chair Marsh.
Thank you, Jake. And a special call out to Justin for agreeing to initiate these conversations with the natural resource agencies. I think that's really what makes sense, because we have empowered OWRD in a way we haven't the others to be really aggressively involved in the law enforcement efforts. So if they can be that conduit to the other agencies, then we can really spread the understanding of what's going on and the possibility of responding. So let's move on to.
I'm sorry, Rep. Marsh. I just want to snuggle your dog. I just have to get that on the record.
I'm so sorry. My dog is going crazy in the next room. While you talk,
it's all good. I just want to go get it and just hold it.
Yeah. We got some neighbor dogs that are causing a lot of consternation here. So with that, we'll pass it on to you, Rep. Morgan, for a report from cannabinoids.
Teach me to not speak up about the puppy dog. Sorry. Just 1 second as I pull that up. Okay, so the cannabinoid subcommittee recommendations. The first one is that methods to prevent sales to minors of industrial hemp commodities or products that contain intoxicating cannabinoids. That we would require adult use cannabis items to be located in an area of a store separate from general food or beverage items, kind of similar to beer and tobacco. That we would require all adult use cannabis items to be labeled not for children or for ages 21 and over. And we consider requirements that all hemp items for human consumption or inhalation to be sold in stores that sell general food items, for example, a grocery store and convenience store, and not hair salons. So there would be an ability to make sure that there's the labeling and sold in places that would actually distinguish that and have enforcement part. So that was kind of the first recommendation out of the group. And it is worth noting that since I brought up hair salons, we did not discuss consumption, that consumption did not include topical products. And then the second recommendation is that testing requirements and methods of enforcement of testing requirements for cannabinoids, including artificially derived cannabinoids, to protect the public health and safety. So support the establishment of a state reference lab to assist ODA, Oregon Health Authority, OLCC, in enforcement of testing standards and laboratory oversight. To require minimum labeling standards for hemp products for human consumption and inhalation. whether those products are made in the state or out of the state, and support expansion of ODA handler licensing to enforce current testing standards. And then the third recommendation is that changes to state law to support the regulation of intoxicating cannabis-derived products and artificially derived cannabinoids. This would be three-part as well, requiring the OLCC to report every odd-numbered year to the legislature on federal or other state regulations for artificially derived cannabinoid products for human consumption and inhalation, and to direct the OLCC to reevaluate the current levels of THC allowed in hemp items on the general market and work with partner agencies and stakeholders to determine if the current levels can be reduced, and recommend the state of Oregon continue to advocate for federal I can almost see without my glasses. Federal streamlining changes in regards to intoxicating cannabis-derived products and artificially derived cannabinoids. So that is the report from our subcommittee.
Thank you. Any members of the subcommittee who want to chime in, or any questions from the committee as a whole? Nothing?
Chair Marsh.
I think it's go ahead, Lauren.
No, I'm sorry. I was just going to add the reference laboratory concept is being built right now at the North Valley complex. There is space there for that reference lab concept and idea. It's moving along quite rapidly, and when I say there's space for it, it's going to be incorporated into our existing reg lab. There has to be security requirements and, obviously chain of custody and protection. It is being built with that in mind. If the legislature moves that idea further along, that facility in Wilsonville will be ready for that. And if it gets there, it would probably be good at some point in time, if it makes it through the legislative process, to actually provide a tour so people can see what we're talking about there, if people would like that. But that's a collaborative thing that we're doing with DAS and OLCC.
Thank you, Lauren. Senator Hansel, you were a member of the subcommittee, I think.
Excuse me, I am, and I just wanted to say that our subcommittee chair was awesome, and that's why you probably didn't have a whole lot of extra comments, because she covered it so well.
Indeed, she is definitely awesome. Okay, team, I'm not seeing a single other hand. So Rep. Morgan, I think that means we will forward your recommendations for the report. Do you feel like there's any other additional subcommittee work to be done, or do you feel like it's all wrapped up?
That is actually a fair question. I would ask the committee members. I mean, to acknowledge what was said earlier, that we did not have consensus on the GMP or the tracking, but I think with the director's recommendation to go through with a registration, that's something that the group as a whole can agree to. And I kind of feel like we're not ready to take on the other one yet.
Okay, great. Well, thank you very much. Thank you for there's a lot of subject matter in that cannabinoid bucket. So thank you to you and to members of your group for sorting it out. So the last committee we have to hear from is law enforcement. And Rob, is that back to you again?
Chair, Senator Przanski is our chair, but I think you wanted me to kind of explain our 7th draft and run through it. But I'm
not sure Senator Przanski, unless he's a telephone number.
He's traveling.
Senator, are you here? Okay.
He's traveling, so I think he wants me to kind of cover it for you.
Okay, go for it.
All right, so basically we are up to our 7th draft legislation. I think probably most task force members are familiar with the 6th draft. We had another meeting since then and made some additional tweaks and completely changed our approach to one of the pieces of this legislation. So I'll just go ahead and, it's okay, just briefly describe what's in this draft legislation. Happy to dig deeper into any of it. I should say These are consensus driven with 2 abstentions and other concerns raised, and you'll see why here in a few minutes. But basically the 7th draft contains the 4 topic areas that we discussed and agreed to move forward to the full task force. And those fit into these 4 categories, and I'll just briefly talk about them each. The first addresses search warrants, cleaning up our statutes and making it more efficient in terms of utilizing search warrants, in particular to address drug trafficking organizations that are engaged in criminal activities in multiple counties of the state. And as we've heard from a number of sheriffs, that's kind of what's happening right now. Those are contained in sections 1 to 3 of the draft 7. Basically what they do, it would be to authorize circuit court judges to issue search warrants outside of their own judicial district when the search involves interrelated conduct carried on in more than one county. It would also clarify when pro tem or senior judges may issue a search warrant. And it also provides examples of other persons that may be necessary for successful execution of a search warrant. Our 7th draft incorporated suggested changes from the Oregon Judicial Department, which we incorporated. And that's basically one chunk of the bill, sections 1 to 3. The second chunk of the bill relates to law enforcement tools, and I'll describe what those are in a moment. That's sections 4 to 6 of the draft bill, which largely reflect a bill that was in process of being enacted prior to the collapse of the 2020 session or 2021 legislation. I forget my numbers here. But basically what it does is it would authorize the use of mobile tracking devices, interception of oral communications, and court-authorized pen registers for felony marijuana offenses. That existed prior to a couple of Senate bills that I could talk about some more, and we were trying to reinsert that a couple of years ago, as I mentioned. So those are tools that law enforcement typically uses in conducting drug trafficking organization investigations, and we need those tools again for these large DTOs. That's the second big piece of draft 7. The third big piece of draft 7 has already been alluded to by others today, and it deals with the enhanced crimes. Enhancements related to folks that are making a lot of marijuana well in excess of anything we would allow in Oregon, are engaged in labor trafficking and crimes associated with labor trafficking, and or engaged in significant environmental crimes, which we've seen a lot of. So there are enhancements relating to all 3 of those in sections 7 to 10 of the 7th draft. And then finally, the 4th big piece of the bill, which you'll find in sections 11 to 13 of the draft. This is the biggest change since draft 6. We chose to use an entirely different process. We originally talked about kind of borrowing some processes that we used to use to deal with meth labs when we had tons of those, but that was kind of a clunky fit. So we found a better fit, which has been referenced before earlier today, which is code enforcement and nuisance abatement. And basically how that would work is it would require, basically it would say, property owner, if you get a notice from law enforcement that you've got an environmental mess here because of one of these illegal drug trafficking organization mass grows, you got 30 days to clean it up. If you don't clean it up, then law enforcement or local government, cities or counties, whoever is the jurisdiction, can initiate a nuisance abatement proceeding to clean it up through public resources or ordering the property owner to clean it up and potentially lien the property for the costs of the cleanup. So it authorizes a new nuisance abatement type of action, very similar to other nuisance abatement actions that we authorize in Oregon law under Chapter 30 and Chapter 215. So that's basically the gist of the 7th draft addressing search warrants, law enforcement tools, enhanced crimes, and cleanup. And with that, I'm happy to take any questions about any of the details of that. It's a 17-page draft, so there are lots of details to discuss at some point.
Thank you, Rob. So I have a quick question here, which is the Water and Natural Resources Committee, as discussed, had sent through the pipeline a request that you look at the question of broadening the use of water statutes in House Bill 4061. Is that, have you had a chance to look at that, or does that fit within your domain at all?
It does, and I would encourage folks from that subcommittee to look at sections 7 to 10, which largely incorporate recommendations from the Oregon Department of Justice for the enhancements. The last thing we added was basically theft of wages as a potential enhancement, but I'd want that subcommittee to look at the 7th draft and see if they want us to tweak any of the language.
Okay, super. And the draft, just to be clear, was that distributed with today's meeting? Have committee members seen that draft? Because I don't think I've seen it.
No, only the subcommittee members have seen it, and that's because I drafted it last evening. Because we had our meeting yesterday. So I think most people have seen the 6th draft. It's very similar except for the last few sections, but the 7th draft has been sent out just to the subcommittee. So I have no problem. In fact, I think we probably ought to send it to everyone on the task force.
Great. So
I'm happy to do
Amanda,
that.
if you can follow up with that. So questions. So we have broad recommendations around in 4 different areas: search warrants, law enforcement tools, enhancements, and code enforcement and nuisance. And this group has clearly been working diligently for a long time. Representative Morgan.
Thank you, Chair Marsh. And I want to bring up a topic I need Rob's help with the group because a topic came up in the subcommittee about handling possession and manufacturing separately. And literally just in the last 2 days, I have received reports that first on the 19th, it was reported in Pamplin Media that in Newburgh, they had a 38-ton marijuana. It was literally a facility. It was Yamhill County, and it was just a storage and transport facility with 38 tons of marijuana that was extremely large scale, with everything intended to go out of state. And they had evidence on scene that they had several transports in and out of state. So here it wasn't necessarily just the grow operation, but most everything was hidden in outbuildings. It was literally just a storage and transport facility intended to get things out of state. And then in my community, we had a large scale mail or a transport company refused to take possession of a massive amount of marijuana intended for out-of-state distribution and contacted the sheriff's office, who was able to some foreign drug trafficking organizers were arrested in my state. But it brought up the conversation of, where does delivery fit into place? Where's the transport and possession? When everything that we started in this group started with kind of, people are growing high THC with hemp licenses. And now look at where we are. That's where this started when I first had a bill concept. But the amount of trafficking and everything else, we are still finding that it's still a massive problem. And I think it is the cusp of where the state police come into play, or maybe the federal nexus of with things being transported out of state. But I don't know if the bill covers that, Rob. I don't know. I'm just curious, because literally just in the last 2 days, today and yesterday, I'm getting these press releases that are not necessarily grow, but they are massive amounts of product.
Sure.
So Rob, what do you think?
Yeah, so the bill actually does cover the bulk of what you mentioned, Representative Morgan. I think you posed a great question. So here's my comments. You'll want to look at sections 7 to 10 of what Amanda's going to send out. It covers both possession and delivery in terms of the enhancement. What it doesn't deal with is delivery. The reason we didn't deal with delivery is there's recent court cases that have narrowed the scope of what delivery can be used for severely. And so in order to address the delivery aspect, we would be raising issues that would apply to all, not just marijuana, but controlled substances generally. And it seems to be a real hot political potential issue that goes well beyond just cannabis. But I think you'll find that the statutes that we have crafted in section 7 to 10 address almost all of what you described. And so I have a look at that when you're looking at those for the water issues as well.
Great. Other questions for Rob or other subcommittee members who would like to chime in? So Rob, what's your next steps? Is your subcommittee, do you feel like you've gelled on your recommendations? Are you still meeting? We're going to want these recommendations to be forwarded for the report, obviously.
Yeah, so unless there's additional drafts that folks want me to do, essentially corrections to the 7th draft or tweaks to that, I'll kind of largely defer to Senator Brzezinski and what he hears from others, because as I mentioned, this 7th draft is fresh as of last night, largely the same as the 6th, but with a lot of tweaks. So I think that your question, the answer, I think the correct answer is we don't know yet. Okay.
It sounds like, I mean, certainly you have a good docket of recommendations.
Yes.
And a thorough vetting of the issues here.
Yes. Now there was not unanimity. There was 2 abstentions from the 7th draft vote that was taken. Now one of the abstentions was to be expected. It was from the OJD representative. They kind of let us know they were going to abstain on everything. But I mean, there may be some pushback on some of the provisions, or may not, and so remains to be seen.
Well, we are, you know, I would say one abstention is fairly remarkable for a set of recommendations that thorough. And unless significant objections are raised at this task force level, I am going to assume that of the task force members, there is consensus for moving in a general sense this set of recommendations forward, recognizing that there still may be tweaks to come. Okay, so it will be done. So colleagues, we have moved through a big docket of work today. We have forwarded recommendations regarding administrative regulation of human and animal hemp products on. We have recommended funding amounts to be tweaked as time goes on and we get more information, and to be discussed in regard to the inclusion of state police. We have recommendations for cannabinoids and for law enforcement and for water in the water as it sits in as a prosecutorial tool. And all of those will be now move over to the domain of Amanda and maybe Sunny or whoever is going to participate in the report writing. So our next obligation as a task force is to come together to approve, review, and hopefully approve a draft report. I think it's clear after today that some of the tweaks in that report may not happen until the very last minute. For example, that discussion around funding. We're talking about trying to push as long as we can so we get as much information as possible and can be as accurate as possible. But I think we have plenty of information for a good solid draft that will really indicate pretty solidly where we're going to go with our set of recommendations. So our next meeting is yet to be scheduled. It will be in November, probably the latter part of the month is my guess. And I assume that all of us will be hearing from Amanda to set that meeting. And again, our goal there will be to review the draft report, knowing that that report in final form will be should be ready for legislative days in December. So with that, that's our next steps. Amanda, anything I've forgotten or that you want to make sure that is mentioned here?
Nope, you covered it. Thank you.
Okay, team. Well, I don't think we have any more work for today. Thank you to everybody who's put so much time and effort in to this discussion. And I hope you have a nice afternoon. I'm going to go walk my dog because he's going crazy. And thank you all for being here so much. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Meeting adjourned.
Bye-bye.